Okay, let's just redo that one more time. So this is today, because of the holidays, we decided this would be kind of a town hall, just open floor, nothing on the agenda to start with, but bring any agenda you'd like kind of meeting. It's still governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, so please just be nice to one another. And with that, we don't have an agenda to start with, so I'll just drink my Diet Coke and people can start talking.
So yeah, like honestly, this is the whole point of this is to make it so that Shane, Rob, and I aren't monopolizing the discussion for a change. But like, I don't know about anyone else, but I'm perfectly capable of monopolizing the discussion if that's what you want. But we figured it would also be cool to like let anyone ask questions they've always wanted to ask, but we're always too busy talking. So let's give you all a few minutes to figure out what you want to say, if that's what you want to do.
Yeah. Have a drink, and remember, there are no dumb questions. No such thing.
Okay, maybe I'll start off with a simple dumb question. I know this been talked about before. I just want to get a refresh. This is regarding to this you have gateway, then you have HTTP route. There's a policy to say, from the cluster operator who normally own the gateway, they issue policy who can associate to gateway, and then somehow let the HTTP route to, I think we talk about, I'm just curious, can you guys reiterate this? Maybe the example, I think I was trying to say, this is my question clear?
So you're talking about policy attachment and how you attach a policy to the gateway and how that works with the HTTP route. Is that?
Yeah, some example. Yeah, exactly. Say for example, you don't want to, I guess the persona of HTTP route owner, you don't want to, sometimes they want to associate to every single gateway. You may want to say, hey, you can only associate to this, for example, dev, whatever gateway, or you can associate to these, billing gateway or something like that. So,
Yep. So also that example that you just used, the intended mechanism there is for people to use allowed routes on the gateway to do that. So the idea there is that you set the allowed routes to HTTP route or something like that, but then there's a namespace part there. So you can say anything in these namespaces can connect to this gateway. And then if someone tries to connect a HTTP route from outside that gateway, then it has to fail. So for outside that that set of namespaces, so you can say only allow billing things to connect to the billing gateway from the billing namespace, for example, and then only HTTP routes that exist in the billing namespace will be able to connect to the billing gateway. So I think that that's probably one of the that part is sort of for the routes, but for policy attachment, the policy attachment thing is designed to have settings that you may want to configure sometimes on or that makes sense on a per HTTP route basis, but you also want to be able to default it or override it at a higher level in the thing. So you have, for example, you have normally you have HTTP routes here, gateway class here, right? And so if you wanted to, if you defined a timeout policy, this is one of the things that Rob and I used as the example because it was actually really hard. We couldn't make a timeout policy that's sits in the actual gateway API. But say, for example, you want a Envoy timeout policy that lets you set, nobody can set their client timeout for their thing to infinity because this is a shared proxy and you want all clients to have to time out at some point. You can't just keep their connections held open forever. So a way you could do that is have a timeout policy object that has a default and an override. In this case, you would say some sort of override that says you can't set this value to infinity. And then if you attach that to the gateway, then the part of the contract for policy attachment is that when you attach something to a gateway, the settings that will apply to all HTTP routes that attach to that gateway. So if you've got 10 HTTP routes attached to it, then none of them will be able to, and you use an override, then none of them will be able to change that particular setting Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you. So regarding the allowed association is the namespace is probably how people normally go with it.
Yes. So there's only two pieces of information that we have in allowed routes at the moment. That is the kind, so the group version kind, and the namespace. So like you can say HTTP routes from the billing namespace, or TLS routes from the billing namespace, or both. But you can't say TLS routes named something from the billing namespace. So you can't like be really specific. You can only sort of do things by the kind and the namespace.
Got it. Does HTTP route side need to do something? I remember hearing something like it's mutual. You need like a two-way.
Yes. So the HTTP route has a parent ref field where the HTTP route needs to say, I want to connect to these gateways. It's a list, so you can have more than one gateway. A HTTP route can attach to more than one gateway, but each of those gateways has to allow that HTTP route to do it.
Got it. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Yep. And in fact, the multiple gateways thing is also useful for if you're, say, provisioning a new gateway and you want everything to be available. You can just connect all your HTTP routes to two gateways and know that the HTTP routes are accessible on both of those gateways, and then you can shut one down or remove it or something like that. Sorry, Rob, you unmuted.
No, I was unrelated. So you did a great job answering that. Thank you. I was just going to say Shane was looking very festive. I appreciate the festive whatever background. But I noticed that there are some names I don't recognize that well on the call. And I know I arrived late, so sorry, but if this hasn't already been offered, if anyone is new to the community and, willing to give just a short, 20-second introduction or longer about what interests you in Gateway API, you are very, very welcome to do that. No pressure, but we always like to learn more about who's interested in Gateway API and what brings you here.
Hey, sorry, I was looking for the mute button. If you guys don't mind, I'll just introduce myself right now.
Yeah, definitely.
Hey, so my name is Alejandro. I used to work for D2IQ. Currently looking for new roles. I'm interested in networking in general, so I'm kind of interested in this new project that Kong has, Blix. I looked through it, thought it was awesome, so I'm looking through it, trying to learn more things about the API gateway, the role-based stuff. I think it's interesting, so that's why I'm here.
Cool, welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Rob, you might have missed this at the beginning. Alejandro and I used to work together at Mesa.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I heard the name and I thought surely there's a overlap there, but I wasn't sure. But
yeah,
cool.
Years ago.
Very cool.
Anybody else? I'm looking. I'm trying to think if I don't recognize anyone. I'm not going to call out anyone. I'm not going to put them on the spot, but please do feel free to jump in and just say hi, even if it's just a hi.
Hey, I guess I'll go. One thing. Hi, my name is Hamza. I'm over at Ambassador Labs, working on like gate ingress, emissary ingress, and the pay product, edge stack. Kind of just been hanging around here just to see what's going on in Gateway API land. I think I briefly met Rob at KubeCon, like with Flynn, and during like that break room session. So just here to see what's going on.
Cool. Good to meet you. Again,
Cool, welcome.
in this case.
I think I'll go next. Hey, everyone. I'm Ramya Jagannath. I'm from SIG Networks. So I work on a custom controller. It's one of our products. And we might be integrating the API gateway. So I'm interested just to know what's going on and see how we can integrate it into our product. And it's nice to meet you all.
Cool. Nice to meet you too.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Did you have any specific questions maybe about like your implementation, or you're currently doing like ingress on Kubernetes?
Yeah, I don't have any specific questions at this point. I'm just, trying to get an intro into the API gateway. Maybe I'll have more questions in the future.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Awesome. I would I hesitate to correct you on your first time out, but one thing that is really important is the terminology. Gateway API implementations are generally API gateways, but gateway API and API gateway can be very, very different things. So the ordering of the words is really important. I'm sorry to be a stickler, but I'm one of the things you probably learn pretty quick is that like I am a bit of a stickler for language, and so gateway API is the name, and it's really important that we get it that way around. Sorry.
No
Yeah, we
worries.
should have
Thank you
named
for
it.
making sure that I got the naming convention right. Yeah, it's helpful.
Yeah,
No,
sorry.
and I should apologize on behalf of the greater community for choosing an awful name. It is very, very confusing, and
We should have named it Service APIs, right, Rob?
Oh my God!
Oh, that was
We
worse,
have been
man.
through a few names here, and everyone calls it API gateway, and it's whatever. So
Inside joke. Service APIs was the previous name of the project. If you didn't know, we had to rename it. That's what it was named when I was at Mesosphere actually, and started lurking the meetings and stuff.
Yeah. So
and it was confusing. It was more confusing than Gateway.
So why did the name went out? Why service? Why not Service API versus Gateway API?
No, this is actually exactly the sort of thing we should be talking about today.
No, it's a legit question. It's just the context and the history makes it funny for me. It's like we did so much effort to like change it away.
Yeah.
But anyway,
this API started as Ingress v2. This is going to be the next generation of Ingress, but that wasn't generic enough because we wanted it to be more than Ingress. So then it became the next generation of service APIs, but then we inexplicably called it, it was Service APIs, I think was the name of the project, but the pluralization got really annoying to work with, and we couldn't just call it Service API because that was already the upstream thing, and it was very easy to confuse with Kubernetes Service, the API, as opposed to this new thing. And Gateway was kind of the front end to our set of API. Naming is hard. I don't know, and we clearly have not been great at it, so apologies. But
one thing that we got was, I think, service and API in any search bar anywhere was a mess. Gateway,
I would imagine.
Gateway and API is a little better. It's a little,
but you do mostly end up with API gateway products.
You do, but it's a little better. It's modicum better.
Yeah.
See, sorry, you go.
Oh, like it doesn't help that there's another thing called Gateway API Gamma, which is for like service meshes, which is in some ways orthogonal to an API gateway. So.
Yeah. So
thank you for bringing that up. I was just about to ask that. Yeah.
That's our project, by the way. If it wasn't clear to people, it's a sub project of Gateway API for doing service mesh with the APIs that we already have. For the most part, Gateway is not a part of that, and not that it never will be or anything, but it's more focused on using the routes right now, and so that can be very confusing. If you're interested, however, that is a completely different meeting. There's that's usually on Tuesdays, so please do check out our community page and the calendar. That's a whole different subsection.
Yeah, this has been great to Mikhail, actually, you were about to unmute. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna ask if it's now time to ask a question.
That's the whole meeting today. Go for it.
Hi everyone. So I want to bring up the validation topic. It's been already discussed previously, but I just want to make sure if there's anything new there. So there is a gap 9.2 about API versioning, and then in that gap there's a recommendation there about not trusting webhook and CRD validation. And there's also an issue 926 with a suggestion to make a kind of common validation library. Well, so my question is, like, if we don't trust like the CRD validation, so I wonder if any implementation implemented like this duplication of CRD validation logic in the control plane. It seems like also like a heavyweight thing, like, you know, importing like CRDs and doing that. So I wonder if anyone actually is doing that, or they write you write your own validation layer.
I feel like Nick and I are about to say the same thing, but
I'm gonna let you go first.
okay. But thank you for raising this, and it's been on my mind for a while, because I feel pretty strongly that if we don't communicate this clearly enough, and we haven't, there will be some future vulnerability, something goes wrong in some bad way with some implementation that doesn't, you know, read the fine print. You know, this is hidden away in a documentation page somewhere. Like the validation we have can't be relied on, or, you know, it can be bypassed at a minimum.
So can be bypassed is a better way to say than can't be relied on.
You're right. You're right.
It's not safe to use it for like really super secure things, because even for CRD validation and stuff like that, you can bypass that by doing kubectl apply force, right? Like, you know, it's not like a super hard requirement. It's there to help you, but it's not a super hard requirement. So that's what Rob is trying to say by it can't be relied on. It's not that it can't be relied on like in general, it's that it's possible, trivially easy to bypass it, right? So you can't use it for like super secure things. That's the thing that is trying to push, I think.
And I think what you are getting at is right now we have webhook validation, which you can import into your controller and run, and hopefully many are doing that today, and that helps a bit. But then if somebody bypasses the CRD validation, well, you know, good luck. That's harder to replicate. And I've been thinking for a while, and I think Nick, in one of the more recent PRs we were talking about, you had said something like along the lines of, why not make webhook validation kind of a superset of CR, you know, it covers everything CRDs we have in our CRD spec plus stuff that can't fit in the CRD spec. That feels like it would address this, but I don't know. Nick, this is probably a good segue to whatever you were going to say.
Yeah. So this is a thing that's a bit of a bugbear for me as well. So I think that it's 100% fair to say that the validation that we have can be bypassed. You don't have to run the webhook. And so like that's one of the things that's a bit tricky, and that's what that paragraph is trying to say is, you know, hey, because you don't currently have to run the webhook to be conformant, like you can kind of, things could end up in a weird state. So part of that is intending to say, hey, implementers, when you're writing your stuff, be aware that if it's an enum, it's not a closed enum, right? Like there might be something else in there that you don't know about. Don't crash, have a default case that's not just panic in Go terms. But I think more importantly, the other thing that I would like to do about this is I want at some point us to have effectively conformance tests for the validation that invalid things will not be accepted in some way, either that they get rejected when you try and apply them, which is what a validating webhook does, or they get status updates that say this is not valid. I'm not 100% sure which one we want to mandate there, or if we want to mandate one or the other. That's sort of still up for discussion a little bit, but I do think that it's a really critical part of our conformance that any implementation that ends up, because the idea behind conformance is that eventually we want to have a process where the same as upstream, where you can get essentially a badge that says Gateway API conformant version 060 or whatever, so that then then people can use your implementation confidently, knowing that due diligence has been done. And part of that, I think, is that your implementation needs to not be sort of able to be worked around by doing sort of trivially easy things like kubectl apply force to like put paths in that let you do path traversal and stuff like that. Is a good example and one that's come up recently. So yeah, I think that's sort of my rough thoughts on that sort of thing. I think in terms of having we've talked before and we have that issue about having a validation library. I think that making the part of conformance will push people to want to have some common library so that we don't all have to implement the same logic over and over again. So like that's sort of my 2 steps removed way of wanting to make that happen. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Well, it seems like the recommendation still stays this applies, so it's not trust and not trust the input. And it's be great to have like a common validation code. But I'm sort of, I tried to like reproduce this bypassing validation, and I couldn't just make it like with this. The way I understand the validate false, the flag, is that just it turns off the client-side validation in kubectl, but the server validation cannot be turned off because it's like an API server.
Okay.
So
yeah, it's been a little while since I tried, so like I could be wrong about that.
And then the API server, like the person who like can create CRDs, I assume it's like a super user, cluster admin. So it's so that's why I'm just thinking about from the security. It's still like, is it like how? I guess how common this, how big is the problem? Can we trust the server?
I think it depends on how your implementation is deployed too. Some implementations of the API are deployed in the same cluster, and so you assume that a cluster admin, somebody who can create a CRD, basically has full control over anything your implementation of the API can do anyways. Other implementations may be deployed somewhere outside of your cluster and may have greater access to resources than your cluster itself has access to. And in those cases in particular, you have to be very careful about what inputs you trust. And so, it's understanding the deployment model and risks involved. I would agree that if the cluster admin is the one who is ultimately the person who can change or bypass a CRD validation, and that's really the top of the line for anything deployed in the cluster, you're probably okay. But if your implementation is can connect to more things, is at risk of some kind of confused deputy attack where you're confusing the controller to grant you access that you shouldn't have, then I would be especially careful.
Yeah, I think some of that came from like both Rob and I have had experiences with ingress controllers where it's pretty easy to do, unless you're really careful and you really look at the fine print. It's actually reasonably straightforward to do some really nasty confused deputy attacks with ingress controllers.
Oh, well, thanks. This is very helpful.
Awesome, great. And that's what we wanted for today. Ask those questions so that we can give you all the background context that is really hard to write down. And thanks, Micaiah, for the alternate name spreadsheet. That is a real blast from the past.
Yeah, I completely forgot about that. It took me a while to find the results of that poll. And in retrospect, I almost wish we'd gone with the routing based names. But I know router is an overloaded term too, so I don't know. Naming is hard.
Yeah, router API. I don't know how much better that would be than gateway API.
Yeah.
It's like I always say, there's 2 hard problems in computing, right? Naming, cache invalidation, and off-by-1 errors.
People would end up at OpenWRT documentation when they were searching for us.
Very true. Yeah.
Like guaranteed.
maybe, I'll anyone is free to bring anything up, but one of the things I'm curious about, just open question to people here, are there things in the API that are either unnecessarily confusing to you? Like I would imagine at least some of the people here on this call have started to work with this API more recently than myself anyway. Are there parts of the API that really felt like rough edges or confusing to understand when you first started looking at it, that maybe we could improve or describe better?
Can I ask a question? I don't know if it's regarding that, but we're trying to figure out conformance tests. Like how do we fulfill that? And I just started looking at the documentation on conformance tests, and maybe I'm not reading it correctly, and I tend to miss a lot of things when I read it. But I don't really see kind of like a template or kind of like this how you do it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think what we've seen a lot of implementations do, especially if your implementation is written in Go, is we've seen implementations, run the conformance tests as part of their regular EDW test suite. So you can import the tests and run them alongside any other tests that you might have for your controller implementation. I think the only thing that we have clearly, that we have in the documentation right now around conformance tests is how you can run them with CLI. So just go test, whatever, and that may not be that useful. I don't know. It's hard to know your workflow, but we definitely haven't clearly documented that a lot of people are just importing these tests and running them in EDW, which I think has been a better experience.
Is that not what you're doing?
Well, I don't know if my implementation is up to par yet to run the conformance test yet, but
are you in Go?
Okay. Our project is running in Go. So you're saying we can import it and then run it as part of our pipeline?
Yeah, that's what we
like
at Kong. That's what we do for all of our implementations. We just we have a conformance test suite, and then it's literally just loading the Go code, literally loading the Go tests and running it on our implementation. You can do that, but we really do not want to have that be the only way that makes sense. So if you do get in a position where you feel like you need to be able to run it from a non-Go, or just you are Go, but you don't want to have to run it in that way, we should probably smooth those edges, because people should be able to come in this with any implementation that is conformant and not have to do Go, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, and one thing I'd say is, I think there's a PR related to this, but I think many implementations of the API kind of built their own way to skip tests, basically, because there are a lot of implementations of the API, especially in the earlier days, where they were conformant with, maybe half of the tests. They could pass half the tests, but they didn't want to run the other half because they knew they hadn't implemented this or that or whatever. I'd recommend that as a starting point. There's been some work to try and bring that into the conformance test definitions themselves, so you don't have to, do it yourself. But if you are looking for examples, I think, I think just about every implementation out there, but I'll highlight, Istio, Kong, Contour, Envoy Gateway. Many implementations are running conformance tests as part of their CI, and I'm sure would be happy to direct you to how they're doing it.
Cool, thanks. We had another question. Someone asked regarding visibility of resources across implementation. So with the gateway class, that basically controls I guess, an implementation of the Gateway API, right? So I'm thinking you can theoretically load 2 or more implementations on the same cluster. Like let's say you load a Kong implementation, or you load an Istio implementation on the same cluster, and then it depends on what, like let's say you create a gateway resource and then you reference a gateway class. So let's say you in your gateway you reference the Kong gateway class, and so then let's say if and then that gateway would obviously choose the Kong implementation, would say, oh, this is for me. Now I'm gonna, provision the gateway resource and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Or if the Istio sees it, it says, oh, this is for me. I'm gonna process this. But does that get into the problem where you have different implementations seeing the same object that may not be for it?
They'll usually filter them.
Right. Okay. So, but that doesn't.
They'll see them, but I mean, they can see them, of course, but they'll usually
And they
what they'll
can
do is filter them based on the controller name.
Right. But they can still inspect them, right?
Yeah,
Obviously.
absolutely. If they have the RBAC permissions to do so, they can look at them.
Yeah.
Right. So
It's pretty
would the
common.
best way, okay. So would the best way to kind of prevent visibility or to control with RBAC?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
I
really
don't
the
s-
only
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
the sky's the limit otherwise.
Yeah.
So practically most controllers a lot of the time get read permissions on gateways everywhere, right? Like basically cluster-wide read permissions on gateways.
Mhm.
One of the reasons for that's actually kind of okay is that we've specifically designed the gateway so that there's nothing secret really in the gateway object. So it should be reasonably safe for a controller to read all gateways and then throw away the ones that it doesn't care about, like reasonably secure. And that's what the gateway class is for. Gateway classes intend to be a bucket that lets your controller be like, I look for all gateway classes that have my controller name. I keep a list of gateway class names, and then when I'm looking at gateways, if the gateway class it references isn't one of mine, then I just throw it away. I drop it on the floor. And so when you're using controller runtime or something like that, it's pretty easy to do that. You just, when you get a thing, it's one of the first checks you do is to say, is this relevant to me? Is this in scope for me? If not, do nothing, no op. And that's sort of the usual way to do this. And like to some extent, the same is true for HTTP route, although the process in that case is more complicated because you've got to figure out if it applies to a gateway that you control. Right? There's another step down in the hierarchy. But it's broadly similar. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that you have to do that cross-reference, the parent ref, and then the listener allowed routes and all that checks, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, but the implementer can still, with HTTP route, you can still kind of see the path configuration, right? Like
Yes. Yeah.
So you can see that that might be a little bit sensitive. I can see how the gateway only references the secret in the namespace. So that's kind of hidden, with RBAC, if that secret in that namespace is not accessible from that implementation
Right.
Yeah, I would say it's entirely possible to segment your controllers in such a way that you could grant it access to a subset of namespaces and then tell users of that implementation they can only create resources in those namespaces. I don't know how. It really depends on what you're putting in your routes and how sensitive they are. I think most of the assumption we've been coming from is like what Nick was saying, that the content of your routes and gateways, at least from our perspective, is not likely to be highly sensitive. But every deployment model is different. So
isn't just the fact of a route sensitive? Like knowing that a particular service is being exposed in a particular way?
Yeah, there could be, if you have a bad actor within the cluster, then theoretically some of these APIs, especially between different implementations, could provide some telemetry.
Yeah.
Which is what I think.
I think
saying.
that
That's
I
kind
think-
of not specific to Gateway API though. I mean, once you have bad actors in your once you have a bad actor in your Gateway API implementation, I think you have potentially much bigger problems than they can see other implementations routes.
Yes. So I think one of the problems here is that a Gateway API implementation needs it needs quite a high level for the full magic, where you could have very dynamic gateway provisioning, very dynamic HTTP route provisioning. You need the implementation needs to have very high cluster-wide privileges for the thing to fully work. You absolutely can make it. You can cut down the RBAC. You can give it restricted RBAC so that it only sees stuff in some namespaces. But that means it only sees stuff in those namespaces, and then anyone who wants to interact with it has to have access to those namespaces as well, right? So that's the trade-off that you're making by doing that, is that but like the fact that the Gateway API implementation is effectively part of the system, right? Like it's part of the infrastructure of the system, and you need to treat it accordingly in the same way that you would like a mutating webhook or something like that. Like it's part of your system implementation. And if anyone ever pops it, like, you're going to get the access that it has. For a lot of people, the way they want the implementation to work is they want people to be able to create gateways reasonably arbitrarily. And they want to be able to have those gateways like pick up TLS secrets from multiple namespaces, or like an arbitrary namespace, in which case your implementation needs to have cluster-wide read access to gateways and cluster-wide read access to secrets, because you can't split secrets on secret type, right? Cluster-wide read access to secrets is often like very scary for people, and that's completely fair because it is very scary. But if you want to get the full sort of maximally dynamic experience, there is no other way than doing cluster-wide access to secrets. The only other way to do it is to segment things off with RBAC, and then you need to have the secrets live in certain namespaces and only certain namespaces. Part of what we're trying to do with Reference Grant is to make it so that users don't need to have cluster-wide access to secrets to be able to use secrets, but your implementation will need to have cluster-wide access to secrets to be able to see those secrets, to be able to read them, to be able to configure them in your underlying data plane. And so that's there's a bit of a fine point there, but like, yeah, I think the fact that this is like network plumbing, like means that it's going to end up with a very high level of access to your system. Like it's very difficult to restrict the access too much without significantly impacting how dynamic your users, the experience your users will get. Does that make sense?
Curious to hear if this is coming from more of a user or operator perspective or an implementer perspective. It's an interesting topic, but I am curious on like the perspective.
Well, I mean, I mostly work with service providers, like communication service providers, and they're targets of espionage, right? And they've got a lot of security concerns, and so like like if you ordinarily you would expect that if you're implementing one set of resources, like a gateway class for one set of apps and a different one for a different set of apps, that they wouldn't be able to see what the other side is doing. But that's kind of not what's going on here, right? Because
you can
you can, but you
in
have
our
to,
implementation, we have the
Yeah.
ability to say by default, the default like customized deployment, we'll just let it see everything that any other implementation could have.
Yeah.
But some users will actually restrict that with customized,
But-
like they'll have their own layer on top of that and say, nope, these things can only see these namespaces. Like that's
But it
that's
also
a
means
legitimate thing, but it's not a natural part of the deployment. It's something you have to choose.
But it also means that if somebody has a bug in their implementation, they could conceivably start operating on like routes that they shouldn't be, right? Or something, right?
If you don't take
Yes.
the proactive measure of like how actually, if you're
Yeah.
in a situation where you are the target of espionage and you're not actively like building your deployment in such a way, like forget the software for a minute, but just restricting that software in your deployment to the minimum thing it needs, principle of least privilege, then yes, you will have that dilemma. I mean, you'll still have other dilemmas even if you do restrict things down, but that's the whole point, is to get it down to the most narrow focus possible, right? So I don't know that every implementation does a good job of this, but there are some implementations out there that can let you kind of do this restriction so that if that implementation became compromised, it would at least not have access to, say, other namespaces than the one for it. But there's still obviously danger there, even in the namespace it's in. There's some, I don't know of any implementations that necessarily do this today, but there's some architectural things that you could theoretically do to improve this that I've actually thought about before, but not implemented yet, where it's still not a silver bullet kind of situation. But if you actually can make the actors which are responsible for things like secrets a completely different actor with a different set of permissions and stuff like that, then the like main controller, basically a microservice or architecture, as opposed to a monolithic like gateway operator or ingress controller, there's some things that you can potentially do to reduce the damage or the scope of an attack even more. But at the end of the day, what Nick said is kind of ultimately true. I mean, it really boils down to like, what something somewhere is going to have to be able to read the secrets.
Yeah.
So,
To be able to configure the data plane, something's got to read the secrets. I would say Kubernetes at large is not great at doing that sort of like really hard multi-tenancy inside a cluster, right? Like, you know, it's Kubernetes multi-tenancy is really pretty soft. Like if you've got access to one thing, it's like there's absolutely things to make it more difficult, but it's very difficult to make it impossible to like privilege escalate around things, or like things kind of expect that you have like reasonably broad level of read access, but a lot of your write access will be limited. Like that's a pretty common assumption, is that controllers that are running as part of the system, like I said, have read access to everything that they need in every namespace in the cluster. Is a pretty common like expectation. You can absolutely, as Shane said, you can absolutely change that by when you run an implementation, the RBAC you grant it can be limited to a number of namespaces, and then when the API server, when it calls like list on the API server, it'll only see the stuff that you've given it access to. So you can absolutely sort of segment things that way. The problem with doing things for stuff that kind of expects to be system-wide is that you're effectively building like a mini system of that sort of set of namespaces, and then everything needs to use RBAC that matches that set of namespaces. And so you've got a sort of big admin overhead to ensure that nothing that is using anything inside that set of namespaces reaches outside that set of namespaces. Otherwise, you may as well just give it access to the whole cluster, because once you go out a little bit and it all doesn't match, then you've got the escape hatch, if you see what I'm saying. And so like I think a lot of people who have tried to do hard multi-tenancy for clusters sort of end up landing on the idea of let's have smaller clusters, one for each tenant. You know, like if you really want to be like, that's the hardest multi-tenancy you can get.
Yeah, I had an
I've seen that a lot.
interesting, or go ahead.
No, I was just doubling up on that. I see that quite a bit with some of my customers. Like they'll end up making the actual, they won't bother with namespaces. It'll be a cluster. That'll be the area of which they'll like do a specific application. And that's easier these days than it used to be, like a lot easier. You know, what's really funny though is like 5-6 years ago, like when Ingress was really new, I feel like every implementation just had cluster admin was was like the default, wasn't it? Like everything was just cluster admin like 6 years ago. But so we've come a long way.
I had a really interesting conversation with Mo from SIG about this and related problems. And one of the areas that I think is interesting to both of us, and I don't think either of us have time to lead it, but if this is something that is interesting to you, there is room for another kind of authorizer in Kubernetes. So if you are familiar with how kubelet works today, it relies on node authorizer to grant it access to the resources that are running on that node. You could perchance have another kind of authorizer that could follow a reference tree and understand this is a thing that this class of resources should have access to, this top level thing, and I'm going to grant you access to anything that ends up being attached in the tree to this controller, right? That requires a generic enough implementation and API that you can follow the tree from the top to the bottom. But if you can do that, and I think Gateway API, it could be done with, you could build a custom authorizer for this very purpose. This is an area of significant concern. If you follow Kubernetes security, you notice that on occasion we have CVEs tied to implementations of Ingress and probably eventually Gateway API over time. And you think about it, we are running applications that are exposed on the edge, which usually have access to all secrets in the cluster. You take that combination of things and again, be very careful as an implementer to be as cautious as you can. But also there's some room to, if there is, a problem in your application, hopefully you're only exposing the minimal set of things that you need to see, not everything. And a better authorization model, a new authorizer, something like that would be a good first step towards that. There are intermediate things that we can do today. The cross namespace secret references actually help with that. You can say all my certificates for this specific implementation are going to live in this namespace, and I'm only going to give this controller access to that namespace and nothing else. There are things you can do today if you're security conscious, but everything is kind of makeshift until we can build a new authorizer to really do this properly. That is a longer term effort, but there's definitely interest from SIG Auth. We just need people with time to do it.
So, I mean, you guys keep talking about having access to all the secrets. Is the secret access purely about certificates?
Yes.
Are there other secrets? Yes.
Yes, just certificates, basically. For Gateway API, it's...
So if the certificates... So if the certificates are being loaded...
So I was just going to say, but certificates, the problem is that certificates are generally stored in secrets inside Kubernetes, and you can't get any more fine-grained with the RBAC, like in terms of type, right? You can't have, unless you make another thing that is a certificate and not a secret, like you can't get any more fine-grained than all secrets in this namespace. That's the most fine-grained you can get. Read access to all secrets in this namespace is the finest grained you can get. You can't say all secrets of type TLS certificate, right? Like unless you make a completely separate type. That's how the type system in Kubernetes works, unfortunately. So that's what I mean by all secrets, is like you can't say only certificates and not like environment variables that are used for pods, right? Because there's no distinction in the type system between that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. We've been talking about actually not getting certificates as secrets, but loading them via gRPC and storing them just in memory. If we do that, we need significantly less access then, right?
Yes. And so to make that work, though, you'll still need, like, the listener TLS config is going to need some way to know which secret that you're loading into memory it needs to use for that specific listener, right? So you're going to need, probably what you would need to do is to have a CID that says, like, an in-memory cert is the name of the CID or something like that. And then in the listener, instead of having a reference to a secret, you have a reference to an in-memory cert that tells you the name of the in-memory cert, right? And that you retrieve in some out-of-band way. Right, so the API has the spot to let you do that. It's just not going to work as seamlessly, right? You're going to have to build some extra infrastructure around it. And that sounds like a great idea, to be honest. That sort of thing for, like, if you want to make sure that the controller doesn't have access to those, like the controller doesn't need access to all secrets in the cluster, then the way to do it is to make it so that the TLS secrets and needs are not in the cluster, right? Like that's effectively the simplest way to solve that problem, is to make it so that the secrets that it needs are not in the cluster. And then all you need to do is to build some sort of naming scheme that lets you pick which secret out of all of the secrets that it has access to in some other way it picks. for that specific, which cert it picks.
Okay, thank you.
And that's why in the listener we left that as a it's not like secret name, it's like it's like a certificate name or something like that, but there's a group version kind selector there. It's not just the secret. It defaults to secret, but you can choose any other type of resource you want.
That I hadn't noticed. I was actually going to suggest that we shouldn't be tying specifically to passing certificates as secrets.
Right.
Okay,
Excellent.
excellent.
That's the thing we don't do.
Yeah.
Yep. Is that something then? What implementation are you working on? If you can say, I'm just curious.
Yeah. So I'm at F5. We have a thing called the Service Proxy for Kubernetes (SPK), and it's really it's focused currently on service providers and launching 5G. And so that's why before I raised like the issue about egress, which is one of our big issues, how we manage secrets and the sort of skeptical nature of our customers around using secrets is another one of the big ones. So yeah.
That's interesting. I don't, not to put you on the spot or like put any work on you, but in time, no, seriously, don't mean to. So please just take it with a grain of salt. But I think we would be happy to host a blog post about your experience when you kind of get further along in this. Like,
yeah,
we have spots for like the Gateway API blog and stuff like that. And this would be kind of interesting, I think, for other implementers and users of Gateway API just to hear about your experience with this, because I think up until now there's not been a ton of concern, but there will probably be a lot more in the future.
Well, yeah, and let me tell you that I have had significant, like tier 1 early adopters say to me, Phil, if you think Gateway API is what we're going to use in the future for 5G, I will force all the vendors to comply to it. So,
all right,
yeah. So we need a couple of additions, and again, I'm super late on creating a document around egress, but if we can cover just a few of the sort of service provider 5G, gaps, I think we can have this be the way that people launch 5G.
Awesome.
That's pretty sweet. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're here to serve. Let us know how we can help you.
Yeah.
Again,
so,
I'm behind on the document about egress. I got to put
okay,
up a shut up.
We're all
at some
behind in our
point.
documents.
Yeah.
We're all behind in our documents, mate. It's like, join the club. I think one thing I just went and looked up the exact thing in the spec, and so we have like there's a struct called secret object reference, which is where you currently store, like, you can just put the name of a secret, because we default to group core kind secret, and there's also an optional namespace field there as well. So, but that does not have to be. We specifically made it so that does not have to be a secret. Yes, I just wanted to make 100% sure that we'd done that right. So yeah, that absolutely is a way that I would recommend if people are really conscious about, really strongly feel that you shouldn't have access to all, that controllers like this shouldn't have access to all secrets. The best solution is to just not put it in the cluster as a secret, right? Like, give it what it needs as in some other way. It could be it could be just stored directly in a CID. I'd probably not recommend that, because secrets have special protections in Cube about like only showing up on the nodes that need them and a bunch of other stuff like that.
Which you can do for CRDs.
But yeah, you would need to jump through
add that, but
yeah, you would need to jump through those hoops for your thing. But I think the thing that you mentioned about storing the certs out of band and having that record be sort of a signal to retrieve the out of band cert from some other gRPC endpoint or something like that, that sounds like a great idea to me for that sort of much more secure use case. 100%. Mikhail asked in the chat that do we require TLS secrets in conformance tests? Yes, we do currently. So, if this became more of a thing, then I would guess that we'd probably need to slice and dice the conformance tests a little bit more to sort of be like, hey, we're testing the sort of common the common cases of you store your stuff in secrets, and then there'd be other conformance tests that would need, or there'd be some other way that you need to test this stuff to be conformant.
Yeah, there's a couple places where we have kind options where we default, I think, and the conformance test just assume the default, where I figured in time we'll probably have to have like an overlay, like just let us know what you do instead and we'll map to it.
Yeah. But that, I think that's 100% a thing that we can do. That will again come back to exactly how we handle how do you submit a conformance report and what does it look like, and what tests did you skip, and are those tests okay to skip, and what overlays did you use, and some other stuff like that, which is kind of similar problems to what upstream Kubernetes has with the upstream Kubernetes conformance. So I'm hoping that we can crib a lot from what they do.
Well,
but yeah, thanks, Philip. That was an awesome question, awesome discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can answer this last question in chat, and then we are at time. I can't read it. Hang on.
Yeah, so Candace, I think, is actually the person working on this right now. So Candace is working on conformance tests for TLS route. Looking forward to getting those in ASAP. Actually, Candace, you may have a better status update than I do. I've been meaning to review your PR.
I just posted an update, so you can take a look at it again, and hopefully I answered your questions, and it's good to go.
Perfect, thank you.
Awesome, and thank you.
Notably, it is probably relevant because before we run out of time, we are probably going to cut 060 in the next couple of days, certainly before the end of the week. But one thing that's important to remember about our versioning is that we do reserve the right to add conformance tests in a patch release. So if that particular test doesn't make it into 060, we can still release a patch release much quicker that only has extra conformance tests in it. And so that applies across conformance tests. So improvements to conformance are patch releases only.
Roger that. All right. Thanks everybody for coming. Just a heads up, I believe we canceled next week's and the following weeks, just because we had so many people say that they wouldn't be able to show up. So we will be back. I want to say that's the second week of the month. It should all be on the calendar. If you need anything during that time, hit us up in Slack and discussions and issues and so forth. Happy holidays, everybody.